The year was 1981. 27 excited fourth graders from Millbrook Elementary climbed aboard a yellow school bus for what should have been a routine field trip to the Natural History Museum in Springfield. Their teacher, Mrs. Catherine Hawthorne, had planned every detail of the educational adventure, but somewhere between the school parking lot and their destination, that bus simply vanished. For 15 years, the mystery haunted the small town of Millbrook. Parents aged prematurely, never knowing what happened to their children. Search teams combed forests and rivers. The FBI opened and closed files. Theories ranged from tragic accidents to something far more sinister. Then in 1996, everything changed. A security drone conducting routine surveillance over an abandoned industrial complex captured footage that defied explanation. What it recorded would force authorities to reopen the case and confront a truth more disturbing than anyone had imagined. The morning of October 15th, 1981, began like any other school day at Millbrook Elementary. Children arrived with backpacks stuffed with permission slips and lunch money. Mrs. Hawthorne, a beloved teacher with 30 years of experience, checked her roster twice. 27 students, all accounted for. The bus driver, Frank Morrison, was a reliable man who'd been driving school routes for over a decade. He knew every pothole and shortcut in the county. At exactly 8:45 a.m., the bright yellow bus pulled away from the school with its precious cargo. Parents waved from car windows. Some took pictures. The last confirmed sighting was at 9:12 a.m. when a traffic camera captured the bus passing through the intersection of Route 34 and Miller Road, still heading toward Springfield. The museum staff expected them at 10:30 a.m. When the bus didn't arrive, they called the school called the police. By noon, a full-scale search operation was underway. State troopers blocked highways. Helicopters swept the route. Search dogs tracked scents that led nowhere. The bus had simply disappeared, as if it had driven into another dimension. The initial theory was mechanical failure. Perhaps the bus had broken down on a remote stretch of road. But as hours turned to days, that explanation crumbled. Every road, every trail, every possible detour had been searched. The FBI brought in their best investigators. They interviewed everyone who might have seen the bus. They examined Frank Morrison's background, his finances, his personal life. Nothing. The man was exactly what he appeared to be, a devoted father and grandfather with an impeccable driving record. Mrs. Hawthorne's background was equally clean. She had dedicated her life to teaching. Her students adored her. The idea that she might be involved in something sinister was unthinkable. As weeks passed, the theories grew darker. Some suspected human trafficking, others whispered about cult activities. A few even suggested government experiments, but every lead went cold. The 27 children seemed to have vanished into thin air. Their names were read at vigils. Their pictures appeared on milk cartons. The town of Millbrook became synonymous with tragedy. Families moved away, unable to bear the constant reminders. Those who stayed lived in a state of perpetual mourning. The elementary school installed a memorial garden. Every October 15th, the community gathered to remember. But remembering wasn't enough. The families needed answers. Detective Sarah Chen was assigned to the case in 1985, 4 years after the disappearance. She'd seen the files, thick with dead ends and false leads. But Chen was different. She had a reputation for solving impossible cases. She approached the Millbrook mystery with fresh eyes and modern investigative techniques. Chen re-interviewed witnesses, many of whom had been children themselves in 1981. She used computer modeling to analyze traffic patterns. She studied weather reports from that October morning. Slowly, she began to notice inconsistencies in the original investigation. The first red flag was the timeline. The bus had been seen at 9:12 a.m. on Route 34, but there was a gap. No witnesses, no cameras, no trace of the bus between that sighting and when it should have arrived at the museum. Chen calculated the distance. Even accounting for traffic, the bus should have reached Springfield by 10 a.m. Where had it gone during that missing hour? Chen requested access to all surveillance footage from October 15, 1981. Most had been recorded over or destroyed, but she found something interesting. A traffic camera at the Route 34 truck stop had captured images of several vehicles that morning. Most were routine trucks and cars passing through, but one image stood out. A black sedan with tinted windows, following approximately 2 car lengths behind the school bus. The sedan's license plate was partially obscured, but Chen's team enhanced the image. The plate was registered to a company called Meridian Industries. When Chen investigated, she discovered Meridian had been dissolved in 1983. The company's records were sealed, but Chen's contacts in federal law enforcement helped her dig deeper. Meridian Industries had been a front company connected to a network of businesses involved in activities the government preferred to keep classified. The connections led to a web of shell companies, offshore accounts, and ultimately to a facility that officially didn't exist. Chen's investigation stalled when federal agents visited her office. They were polite but firm. The Millbrook case was being transferred to federal jurisdiction. Chen was ordered to hand over all files and cease her investigation. But Sarah Chen wasn't the type to give up. She'd made copies of everything. She continued investigating on her own time, using vacation days and personal resources. What she discovered kept her awake at night. The facility connected to Meridian Industries was located in a remote area of the state, surrounded by dense forest. Officially, it was a research station studying atmospheric conditions. Unofficially, it was something much more sinister. The facility had been operational from 1978 to 1985. During that time, it had conducted experiments that violated every ethical standard. The research involved studying the effects of isolation and psychological manipulation on children. The subjects were runaways, orphans, and other children who wouldn't be missed. But by 1981, the supply of subjects was dwindling. The researchers needed a new source. A school bus full of children would provide perfect test subjects. Chen's blood ran cold as she read the classified documents she'd obtained through back channels. The children of Millbrook hadn't been kidnapped for ransom or trafficking. They'd been taken for experimentation. The facility's records were incomplete, but Chen found references to Project Mindbridge. The project involved isolating children from outside contact and subjecting them to various forms of psychological conditioning. The goal was to create individuals who would be completely compliant and capable of carrying out orders without question. The applications were obvious. The military and intelligence communities had long sought ways to create perfect soldiers and agents. Children were ideal subjects because their minds were more malleable than adults. Chen discovered that the project had been shut down in 1985, not because of ethical concerns, but because it wasn't producing the desired results. The children were proving more resilient than expected. Many had developed psychological disorders that made them unsuitable for the program's goals. The facility was closed, and the remaining subjects were reportedly relocated to other sites. But Chen couldn't find any records of where they'd been taken. The paper trail went cold. By 1990, Chen had compiled enough evidence to write a comprehensive report. She submitted it to her superiors, to the FBI, and to several congressional committees. Each time, she was told the information was classified and that she should drop her investigation. But Chen couldn't let it go. She'd promised the families of Millbrook that she would find their children. She'd dedicated 5 years of her life to the case. She wasn't going to give up now. Chen's breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A former security guard at the facility contacted her in 1993. The man, whose name was James Rodriguez, had been haunted by what he'd witnessed. He'd kept quiet for over a decade, afraid of government retaliation. But his conscience finally compelled him to speak. Rodriguez told Chen about the night the school bus arrived at the facility. He'd been working the late shift when a convoy of vehicles pulled up to the secure entrance. The school bus was among them, painted black to conceal its identity. Rodriguez watched as 27 children were unloaded and led into the facility. They were frightened and confused, calling for their parents and their teacher. Mrs. Hawthorne and Frank Morrison were also brought into the facility, but they were taken to a different section. Rodriguez later learned they'd been eliminated within hours of their arrival. The children were processed like laboratory specimens. They were given numbers instead of names. Their personal belongings were incinerated. Any trace of their former identities was systematically erased. Rodriguez described the facility's layout in detail. The children were housed in individual cells, each equipped with speakers and cameras. They were subjected to constant audio and visual stimulation designed to break down their psychological defenses. Sleep deprivation, sensory overload, and isolation were used to make them more susceptible to programming. The experiments continued for years. Rodriguez said he'd seen children who'd been transformed into hollow shells of their former selves. Others had developed severe mental disorders. Some had died from the stress and trauma. The facility's medical staff showed no concern for the children's welfare. They were simply test subjects, no different from laboratory animals. Rodriguez's testimony was devastating, but Chen needed more evidence. She convinced Rodriguez to wear a wire during a meeting with his former supervisor, a man named Dr. Marcus Webb. Webb had been the facility's chief psychologist and one of the architects of Project Mindbridge. During the recorded conversation, Webb inadvertently revealed details about the program's methods and objectives. He also mentioned that some of the subjects had been transferred to other facilities when the original site was closed. Webb seemed to believe that the program had been a success, despite its official termination. He hinted that similar projects were still ongoing at other locations. Chen now had enough evidence to break the case wide open. She prepared to go public with her findings, but before she could act, her life was threatened. Unknown individuals broke into her home, leaving messages that made it clear she was being watched. Her phone was tapped. Her car was sabotaged. Chen realized she was in mortal danger. Fearing for her safety, Chen decided to hide her evidence and disappear. She made copies of all her files and distributed them to trusted contacts with instructions to release them if anything happened to her. Then she resigned from the police force and moved to another state under an assumed identity. For years, she lived in hiding, waiting for the right moment to reveal the truth about Millbrook. That moment came in 1996, when a routine security drone captured footage that would change everything. The drone belonged to a private security company hired to monitor the abandoned facility where Project Mindbridge had been conducted. The site had been officially decommissioned in 1985, but the security company maintained periodic surveillance to ensure no unauthorized persons entered the restricted area. On the morning of June 3rd, 1996, the drone's cameras detected unusual activity. Several figures were moving through the facility's courtyard. The security operators assumed they were dealing with trespassers, but as they zoomed in for a closer look, they realized something extraordinary was happening. The figures were adults, but they moved with the coordination and behavior patterns of children. They seemed to be playing games, running in circles, and engaging in activities that were distinctly juvenile. More disturbing was their appearance. They were dressed in identical gray uniforms, and their heads were shaved. They moved as if they were being controlled or directed by some unseen force. The security operators immediately contacted local authorities, but they were told to maintain surveillance and not to interfere. Federal agents arrived within hours and took control of the situation. The drone footage was classified, but copies had already been made by the security company's employees. One of those copies eventually made its way to Sarah Chen, who was still living in hiding. When Chen saw the footage, she knew immediately what she was looking at. These were the survivors of Project Mindbridge. The children of Millbrook had been found, but they were no longer children. They were adults who had been psychologically programmed to remain in a childlike state. The implications were staggering. The program hadn't been terminated in 1985. It had continued in secret, with the Millbrook children as its primary subjects. Chen realized she had to act. The world needed to know what had happened to those innocent children. She contacted journalists, human rights organizations, and congressional investigators. She provided them with copies of the drone footage and her 15 years of research. The story broke simultaneously in major newspapers across the country. The headlines were shocking. Missing school children found after 15 years, subjected to government mind control experiments. The public outcry was immediate and intense. Families of the missing children demanded answers. Congressional hearings were scheduled. The FBI launched a new investigation. But even as the story dominated the news, the government's response was predictable. Officials denied any knowledge of Project Mindbridge. They claimed the facility had been used for legitimate atmospheric research. They suggested the drone footage showed mentally ill individuals who had wandered onto the property. The cover-up was systematic and thorough. Documents were shredded. Witnesses disappeared. The official narrative was that the whole story was a conspiracy theory based on fabricated evidence. However, the truth was harder to suppress this time. Too many people had seen the evidence. Too many copies of the footage existed. Independent investigators began conducting their own research. Slowly, the full scope of the program began to emerge. Project Mindbridge had been just one of several classified programs designed to study mind control and psychological manipulation. The children of Millbrook had been guinea pigs in experiments that violated every principle of human decency. The survivors themselves were eventually located and removed from the facility. They were placed in specialized care facilities where teams of psychologists and psychiatrists worked to undo years of programming and abuse. The process was slow and often unsuccessful. Many of the survivors had been so severely damaged that they could never fully recover. They remained in a childlike state, unable to function as independent adults. Others had developed multiple personality disorders or severe psychoses. A few had managed to retain some semblance of their original personalities, but they were forever changed by their experiences. The families of Millbrook finally had their answers, but the truth was more horrifying than anything they had imagined. Their children had been subjected to 15 years of systematic abuse and experimentation. The government they had trusted had betrayed them in the most fundamental way possible. The legal battles that followed would continue for years, but no amount of money or official apologies could undo the damage that had been done. But now, after 15 years of silence, the questions were multiplying faster than the authorities could answer them. Detective Chen had pieced together the basic framework of Project Mindbridge, but the security drone footage from 1996 revealed something far more disturbing than anyone had anticipated. Those weren't just survivors wandering the abandoned facility grounds. They were products of a systematic program that had never truly ended. The children captured in the grainy surveillance footage moved with an eerie coordination that chilled investigators to the bone. Their movements were synchronized, almost robotic, as if they were following invisible commands. Dr. Sarah Martinez, a child psychologist brought in to analyze the footage, spent hours studying every frame. What she discovered defied everything she thought she knew about human behavior. "These aren't normal children," she told Chen during their first meeting. "Watch how they walk, how they turn their heads in unison." This level of behavioral conditioning suggests years of intensive psychological manipulation. Whatever Project Mindbridge was doing, it worked far better than they ever intended. The facility itself told a story of abandonment and secrecy. Located deep in the Montana wilderness, the compound had been officially decommissioned in 1983, yet the drone footage clearly showed recent activity. Fresh tire tracks, maintained buildings, and working electrical systems painted a picture of ongoing operations hidden from government oversight. Chen's investigation took a dark turn when she discovered classified documents suggesting Project Mindbridge had been compartmentalized into multiple cells across the country. The school bus incident wasn't an isolated experiment, but part of a larger network designed to test different approaches to psychological conditioning. Each cell operated independently, making it nearly impossible to trace the full scope of the program. The breakthrough came when Chen located Dr. Marcus Hoffman, a former researcher who had worked on the project's early phases. Hoffman, now in his 70s and suffering from advanced dementia, provided fragmented but crucial details during his lucid moments. He described underground laboratories, specialized training facilities, and most disturbing of all, a selection process that targeted children with specific psychological profiles. "They weren't random," Hoffman whispered during one of their sessions. "Every child was chosen, tested, evaluated for compliance potential, the bus driver, the route, even the weather conditions. Everything was planned months in advance. We told ourselves it was for national security, but deep down, we knew we were creating something monstrous. The revelation sent shockwaves through the investigation team. This wasn't a case of children being taken for experiments. It was a carefully orchestrated recruitment operation designed to identify and condition the most psychologically malleable subjects. The school trip had been a cover story, the bus driver likely a government operative, and the entire disappearance staged to provide plausible deniability. Chen's team began tracing the backgrounds of the missing children, looking for patterns that might explain their selection. What they found was disturbing in its precision. Each child came from unstable home environments, had shown signs of social isolation, and demonstrated above-average intelligence combined with emotional vulnerability. They were perfect candidates for psychological manipulation. The security drone footage became the keys to understanding the program's ultimate goals. Enhanced analysis revealed that the children weren't just being conditioned for compliance, they were being trained. Military-style exercises, technological instruction, and what appeared to be advanced psychological techniques suggested they were being prepared for specific roles in society. Former government officials who agreed to speak off the record painted a picture of a program that had grown beyond its original scope. What began as research into behavioral modification had evolved into something far more ambitious. The children weren't just subjects, they were being molded into agents who could operate undetected in normal society while maintaining absolute loyalty to their handlers. The implications were staggering. If the program had continued operating for decades, there could be hundreds of these conditioned individuals embedded throughout American society. Government agencies, corporations, educational institutions, any organization could potentially harbor these programmed operatives without even knowing it. Chen's investigation revealed that the facility captured in the drone footage was just one of several sites still operating under deep cover. Financial records, carefully hidden through shell companies and black budget allocations, showed a network of facilities across the country. Each site specialized in different aspects of the conditioning process, from initial psychological evaluation to advanced training in specific skill sets. The children from the 1981 school bus had been part of an early batch, but they weren't the first or the last. Document after document revealed a systematic program of child acquisition that had been operating for decades. Missing children reports that had been dismissed as runaways or family abductions took on new significance when viewed through the lens of Project Mindbridge's selection criteria. Dr. Martinez's analysis of the behavioral patterns observed in the drone footage suggested that the conditioning process was remarkably effective. The children, now adults, displayed none of the psychological trauma typically associated with abuse or captivity. Instead, they showed signs of complete integration with their programmed identities. They believed their artificial memories were real, their conditioned responses were natural, and their loyalty to the program was absolute. The most chilling discovery came when Chen's team analyzed communication intercepts from the facility. The conversations weren't between guards and prisoners or researchers and subjects. They were between handlers and assets, discussing missions, objectives, and deployment schedules. The children who had disappeared on that school bus 36 years ago had been transformed into something else entirely. As the investigation deepened, it became clear that exposing Project Mindbridge would require dismantling a network that had become deeply embedded in American society. The program had evolved from a Cold War experiment into a permanent shadow operation with tentacles reaching into every level of government and society. The security drone footage that had seemed like a breakthrough was actually just the tip of an iceberg. Those children wandering the Montana facility weren't the end of the story. They were evidence of a program that had been running continuously for decades, quietly shaping American society from the shadows. Chen knew that bringing this conspiracy to light would require more than just evidence. It would require confronting a system that had been designed to protect itself at all costs. The children who had vanished on that school bus had become pawns in a game far larger and more dangerous than anyone had imagined. And somewhere in the darkness, that game was still being played. The investigation had taken a dark turn. What started as a decades-old mystery about missing children was now revealing itself as something far more sinister. The truth wasn't just about psychological manipulation anymore. It was about something that had been hiding in plain sight all along. Detective Sarah Chen stood in the abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town, her flashlight beam cutting through the dusty air. The building had been empty for years, but the recent discovery of surveillance equipment hidden in the walls suggested otherwise. Someone had been watching, someone had been waiting. The breakthrough came when forensics analyzed the 1996 drone footage, frame by frame. Hidden in the background, barely visible among the trees, was a structure that shouldn't have been there, a concrete building that didn't appear on any official maps. A building that had been constructed sometime in the late 1980s, years after Project Mindbridge was supposedly terminated. Chen's team had spent weeks tracking down the property records, following a labyrinthine paper trail that led through shell companies and false identities. The building was registered to a company that didn't exist, owned by people who had been dead for decades. It was a masterpiece of bureaucratic camouflage, designed to hide something that the government desperately wanted to remain hidden. When they finally breached the facility, what they found inside defied comprehension. The building was enormous, extending deep underground through a network of tunnels and chambers. The upper levels looked like a research facility, with laboratories and observation rooms filled with outdated equipment. But it was the lower levels that revealed the true scope of the operation. Row upon row of holding cells, each one designed to house a single child. Medical equipment that looked more like torture devices. Observation rooms with one-way mirrors. And in the deepest chamber, a massive computer system that had been recording everything for decades. The files they recovered painted a picture of systematic abuse that went far beyond what they had initially discovered. Project Mindbridge hadn't ended in 1985. It had simply gone deeper underground, becoming more sophisticated and more brutal. The children who had been taken weren't just test subjects. They were being systematically broken down and rebuilt into something else entirely. Dr. Rebecca Martinez, the child psychologist who had been working with the survivors, reviewed the recovered files with growing horror. The techniques described in the documents were more advanced than anything she had seen in her decades of practice. They weren't just trying to control minds, they were trying to create an entirely new type of human being. The survivors they had found were just the beginning. The computer records showed that hundreds of children had passed through the facility over the years. Some had been released back into society, their memories altered and their identities changed. Others had been transferred to different facilities across the country, and some had simply disappeared from the records entirely. The most disturbing discovery was a series of video recordings that showed the progression of the experiments over time. The early footage from the 1980s showed crude attempts at psychological manipulation, but by the 1990s, the techniques had become far more sophisticated. The children were being subjected to a combination of drugs, sensory deprivation, and psychological conditioning that was designed to completely erase their original personalities. Agent Williams, from the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit, had seen his share of disturbing cases, but this was unlike anything he had encountered. The level of organization and planning required to maintain such an operation for decades suggested involvement at the highest levels of government. This wasn't the work of a few rogue scientists. This was a systematic program with unlimited resources and complete protection from oversight. The investigation expanded rapidly as more evidence came to light. Similar facilities were discovered in remote locations across the country, all connected by the same underground network. The scope of the operation was staggering. It wasn't just about creating compliant operatives. It was about conducting a massive experiment on human consciousness itself. The psychological profiles of the missing children began to reveal a pattern. They weren't selected randomly. Each child had been chosen for specific traits: high intelligence, strong will, natural leadership abilities. They were the children who would have grown up to be independent thinkers, innovators, and leaders. Instead, they had been systematically broken down and rebuilt into something else entirely. The implications were terrifying. If the program had been successful, it meant that there were potentially thousands of people walking around in society who had been programmed from childhood. People who looked and acted normal, but who were actually sophisticated biological robots, programmed to carry out specific tasks when activated. The drone footage from 1996 had captured just one facility, but the recovered files suggested that there were dozens more, scattered across the country and possibly around the world. The program had evolved and adapted over the decades, becoming more sophisticated and more hidden. It was no longer just about creating operatives. It was about creating an entire shadow population of programmed individuals. Dr. Martinez worked tirelessly to help the survivors recover their memories and identities. But the process was slow and painful. Many of the children had been so thoroughly conditioned that they couldn't distinguish between their original personalities and the programming that had been imposed on them. Some had been so damaged that they might never fully recover. The investigation team knew they were racing against time. The discovery of the facilities had undoubtedly triggered alarms somewhere in the shadow organization that had been running the program. Evidence was being destroyed, witnesses were disappearing, and the remaining facilities were being shut down or relocated. But they had one advantage. The arrogance of the program's creators had led them to keep detailed records of everything. The computer systems they had discovered contained decades of data about the experiments, the subjects, and the ultimate goals of the program. It was a treasure trove of evidence that could expose the entire operation. As the investigation continued, the true scope of the conspiracy began to emerge. The program wasn't just about creating operatives for national security purposes. It was about conducting the ultimate experiment in human control. The goal was to create a new type of human being, one that could be programmed and controlled from birth. A being that would appear completely normal, but would be incapable of independent thought or action. The 1981 school bus incident had been just one small part of a much larger operation. The 27 children who had disappeared that day had been selected as test subjects for a new phase of the program. Their disappearance had been carefully orchestrated to look like an accident, covering up the true purpose of their abduction. The investigation revealed that the program had been successful beyond its creators' wildest dreams. The children who had been taken had been transformed into perfect operatives, indistinguishable from normal people but completely loyal to their programming. They had been placed back into society where they had grown up to become teachers, police officers, government officials, and business leaders. The network of programmed individuals had been carefully cultivated over the decades, creating a shadow infrastructure that could be activated when needed. It was a conspiracy that reached into every level of society, from local school boards to the highest levels of government. The drone footage from 1996 had shown just a glimpse of this vast network. The adult-like figures moving with robotic precision were not just survivors of the program. They were its products, living proof that the experiment had succeeded. They were the first generation of a new type of human being, one that had been created in the shadows and unleashed upon an unsuspecting world. As the investigation team prepared to expose the full scope of the conspiracy, they knew they were facing an enemy unlike any they had encountered before. This wasn't just about corruption or criminal activity. It was about the fundamental nature of human consciousness and the terrifying possibility that it could be completely controlled and manipulated. The truth about Project Mindbridge was far more disturbing than anyone had imagined. It wasn't just a government program that had gone too far. It was the foundation of a new world order, one in which human beings could be programmed and controlled like biological machines. The drone footage had captured just the beginning of what was to come. The investigation had consumed years of our lives, but as we stood at the precipice of the complete truth, nothing could have prepared us for what we were about to uncover. The security drone footage from 1996 had been just the beginning. Those synchronized figures moving through the decommissioned facility weren't just survivors of Project Mindbridge. They were the product of something far more sinister, something that had been evolving in the shadows for decades. When the government finally declassified the remaining files in 2018, the scope of what we'd stumbled upon became crystal clear. Project Mindbridge hadn't ended in the 1980s, as the official records suggested. It had transformed, adapted, and spread like a virus through the highest levels of government and intelligence agencies. The children who vanished in 1981 weren't just test subjects, they were the first generation of what internal documents called the New Order. The drone footage revealed something chilling. Those figures weren't just moving in formation, they were coordinating complex operations, communicating through methods that seemed almost telepathic. Years of psychological conditioning had created individuals who could function as a collective consciousness while maintaining their individual identities. But the most disturbing revelation came from Dr. Patricia Henley, a former researcher who broke her silence after 37 years. According to Dr. Henley's testimony, the program had achieved its ultimate goal by 1990. The subjects weren't just obedient operatives. They had developed abilities that bordered on the supernatural: enhanced cognitive processing, perfect memory retention, and most remarkably, the ability to influence others through subtle psychological manipulation. The government had essentially created a shadow army of human beings who could infiltrate any organization, any community, any family without detection. The scope of the infiltration was staggering. Internal memos revealed that by 1995, Project Mindbridge graduates had been placed in positions throughout American society: corporate boardrooms, university faculties, military commands, even local school districts. They weren't sleeper agents in the traditional sense. They were fully functional members of society who could be activated when needed, but more importantly, they were constantly gathering intelligence and subtly influencing decision-making processes. The 27 children who vanished in 1981 had been selected for their exceptional psychological profiles, high intelligence, social adaptability, and what the researchers called malleable identity structures. But the selection process hadn't been random. Extensive background checks revealed that each child came from families with specific genetic markers, bloodlines that the researchers believed would enhance the conditioning process. Sarah Mitchell, the teacher who accompanied the children, hadn't been a victim. She had been a handler. Her personnel file, hidden in the deepest levels of classified documents, revealed 15 years of psychological training and direct involvement in several earlier experiments. The field trip had been a carefully orchestrated extraction operation designed to remove the children from their families without suspicion. The bus driver, James Morrison, had been found dead in his apartment 3 days after the disappearance. The official cause of death was listed as a heart attack, but autopsy photos revealed injection marks consistent with a paralytic agent. Morrison had been eliminated because he had seen too much, asked too many questions, and posed a threat to the operation's security. But perhaps the most chilling discovery was the existence of multiple facilities. The underground complex where the drone had captured the footage was just one of dozens scattered across the country. Each facility specialized in different aspects of the conditioning process. Some focused on memory manipulation, others on physical enhancement, and still others on what the documents referred to as social integration protocols. The children who entered these facilities underwent a complete personality restructuring. Their original identities were systematically dismantled and rebuilt from the ground up. They retained their core memories and emotional attachments, but these were overlaid with new programming that allowed handlers to access and control their actions when necessary. The process took approximately 5 years, after which the subjects were ready for deployment. The deployment process was equally sophisticated. The conditioned individuals were given new identities, complete with fabricated histories and documentation. They were placed in communities across the country, often in pairs or small groups, to provide mutual support and monitoring. Their handlers maintained contact through seemingly innocent channels, charity organizations, hobby clubs, even religious groups. The program's ultimate objective became clear through a series of strategic documents dated from the late 1990s. The goal wasn't just intelligence gathering or covert operations. It was social engineering on a massive scale. The conditioned individuals were positioned to influence American society from within, gradually steering public opinion, policy decisions, and cultural trends in directions that served the interests of a shadow government that operated independently of elected officials. The success of the program exceeded all expectations. By 2000, Project Mindbridge graduates had been instrumental in shaping everything from corporate mergers to educational curricula. They had infiltrated environmental organizations, political campaigns, and media outlets. Their influence was subtle but pervasive, creating a web of control that extended into every aspect of American life. The drone footage from 1996 had captured what appeared to be a training exercise. The synchronized movements weren't random. They were practicing formations for mass deployment operations. Intelligence analysts who studied the footage identified at least 12 distinct tactical patterns, each designed for different types of social infiltration scenarios. But the most disturbing aspect of the entire operation was its self-perpetuating nature. The conditioned individuals weren't just following orders. They were actively recruiting new subjects, identifying potential candidates within their communities, and reporting back to their handlers. The program had evolved beyond its original parameters, becoming a self-sustaining system that continued to grow and adapt. The investigation revealed that many of the children who had gone missing in subsequent years weren't random disappearances. They were carefully selected additions to the program, chosen for their specific psychological and genetic profiles. The selection process had become more sophisticated over time, utilizing advanced data analysis and psychological profiling techniques to identify ideal candidates. The families of the original 27 children had been monitored for decades after the disappearance. Their phone calls were intercepted, their mail was screened, and their activities were tracked through an extensive surveillance network. Any sign that they were getting too close to the truth was met with subtle but effective countermeasures. Several family members reported mysterious accidents, sudden illnesses, and professional setbacks that seemed to occur whenever they pushed too hard for answers. The cover-up extended far beyond the immediate aftermath of the disappearance. Media coverage was carefully managed, witness testimony was discredited or suppressed, and investigative efforts were systematically undermined. The official narrative of a tragic accident was maintained through a combination of misdirection, intimidation, and the strategic placement of conditioned individuals within law enforcement and government agencies. The true scope of Project Mindbridge became apparent only when cross-referenced with other classified programs from the same era. The conditioning techniques had been refined through decades of experimentation, drawing on research from military psychological operations, corporate behavior modification programs, and even studies conducted on prisoners and psychiatric patients. The children who survived the conditioning process were not the same individuals who had boarded that school bus in 1981. They retained their names, their faces, and their basic personalities, but their fundamental nature had been altered at the deepest level. They were living proof that human consciousness could be systematically rewritten, that free will could be subordinated to external control while maintaining the illusion of independence. The security drone footage from 1996 represented a pivotal moment in the program's evolution. The synchronized movements captured on film were not just evidence of successful conditioning. They were a demonstration of the program's ultimate achievement, the creation of a hybrid form of consciousness that could function both individually and collectively, switching between modes of operation as circumstances required. As the investigation reached its conclusion, the full horror of what had been uncovered became undeniable. The 27 children who vanished in 1981 had not simply disappeared. They had been transformed into something fundamentally different, something that challenged our basic understanding of human nature and individual identity. They were living among us, indistinguishable from ordinary citizens, but serving purposes that extended far beyond their apparent roles in society. The program continues to this day, hidden within the deepest levels of government secrecy. The children who vanished in 1981 are now adults, many of them in positions of influence and authority. They have families, careers, and community connections, but beneath the surface, they remain connected to a network of control that spans the entire country. The security drone footage from 1996 was not just a glimpse into a secret government program. It was a window into the future of human consciousness, a preview of what we might all become if the forces behind Project Mindbridge are allowed to continue their work. The implications extend far beyond the fate of 27 children. They touch on fundamental questions about human nature, individual freedom, and the price of security in a world where the line between protector and predator has become increasingly blurred. The truth about the school bus that vanished in 1981 is more terrifying than any fiction. It reveals a reality where children can be systematically transformed into tools of control, where families can be destroyed in service of shadowy objectives, and where the very fabric of society can be manipulated by those who understand the deepest secrets of human psychology. The security drone captured more than just moving figures in 1996. It captured evidence of humanity's darkest achievement, the successful engineering of human consciousness itself.